What happens when the person you thought was weak becomes the one you can't control? That question isn't just rhetorical, it's a mirror. A mirror held up to the face of those who once fed off someone else's silence, someone's need to please, someone's unhealed heart. You see, this is not a tale of revenge. It's not a dramatic comeback, a triumphant flex in the name of justice. No, this is the quiet, sacred story of awakening, of someone who went so deep into themselves that they emerged unrecognizable. Not to the world, but to the one who once believed they'd never change. Because a healed empath is not the same soul the narcissist once played like a puppet. They are not the same open wound, not the same broken savior, not the same yes to every emotional theft disguised as love. Something inside them shattered, and from those cracks, light poured in. But this light is not naive. It does not chase, it does not beg, it does not need to be chosen. This light stands alone and says, I see now, I know now, and I will never forget again. Carl Jung said, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. The empath once lived, dreaming of being enough, being seen, being understood. But when the dream became a nightmare, they finally opened their eyes, and what they saw was the truth, that their love had become currency in a game where only one person ever got fed, so they stopped playing. They stopped bleeding for people who clapped when they suffered. They stopped waiting for apologies that never came. And that's when the real shift began. Not loud, not public, not for show, but deep within, where real transformation always starts. This story is not about punishment, it's about clarity. It's about the moment the empath realizes that what they called connection was actually control, that what they called loyalty was really bondage, and that who they thought they were soft, too emotional, too much, was actually their deepest strength waiting to be reclaimed. This isn't a warning to the narcissist, it's a resurrection of the empath. And when you've been buried beneath someone else's shadow for so long, rising feels like a revolution. Carl Jung once said that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And nothing illustrates that better than the relationship between the empath and the narcissistic connection, that isn't always romantic, but is always deeply psychological. This isn't just chemistry. It's shadow meeting shadow, light meeting a void. One person born to feel it all, the other built to feel nothing they don't control. At first, it looks like destiny. The empath sees the narcissist's wounds and calls it depth. The narcissist sees the empath's softness and calls it supply. One gives, the other takes. And at the beginning, both believe they've found something profound, but the truth? They've stepped into a dance choreographed by unconscious wounds. The empath, often shaped by early experiences of needing to care for others to feel loved, is magnetically pulled toward those who require fixing. And the narcissist, often created by neglect or overinflation, seeks those who will reflect back a version of themselves they can tolerate. It's not love, it's survival. The empath feels deeply, sensing the unspoken pain behind the narcissist's charm, but the narcissist doesn't want to be healed, they want control. And control requires an open heart willing to self-abandon in the name of peace. That's what the empath offers at first, until they start to notice the cost, the emotional bankruptcy, the hollow apologies, the gaslighting disguised as logic, the praise that turns to criticism the moment they say no. You see, this bond isn't random, it's archetypal. It's the unhealed empath's shadow of fear of being alone, of not being enough, of needing to earn love, being exploited by someone who long ago decided love was a transaction, not a connection. The empath offers emotional depth. The narcissist reflects only illusion, and yet this collision is necessary. Because it is often through the pain of being used that the empath is forced to finally face themselves. What Jung teaches us is this: what we don't face, we repeat. And many empaths find themselves in the arms of narcissists again and again, until one day finally they stop. They stop reaching outside for something only found within. And that's when the healing begins. Not because they win the narcissist back, but because they finally choose themselves. Narcissists don't fall in love, they recruit. They study you not to understand, but to disarm, not to connect, but to control. And in the beginning it feels intoxicating, like you've finally been seen, heard, chosen. But it's not love. It's a tactic, a performance, a psychological campaign dressed as affection. Love bombing is how it begins: grand gestures, intense attention, a level of emotional investment that feels too good to be true. Because it is. They mirror your hopes, speak your language, adopt your dreams. You think you've found your soulmate. But in reality, you've met someone who's studied how to become what you most desire so they can later weaponize it. Then comes the gaslighting, the rewriting of your reality in subtle strokes. They don't scream at first. They imply. They twist. They ask, "Are you sure?" when you know you're right. They make you doubt your memory, your feelings, your instincts. You begin apologizing for things you didn't do. You start checking yourself before speaking. You walk on eggshells in a house you once felt safe in. And then, there's control through confusion. They create emotional whiplash. One day, admiration; the next, indifference. A kind word followed by a cutting remark. Just enough warmth to keep you reaching, just enough cruelty to keep you small. You live on an invisible leash, and you don't even realize you're being walked. But here's the truth they never expect you to see. They choose unhealed empaths for a reason. Because you're soft, because you're generous, because your worth has been tied to how well you can soothe others. They sense your hunger to be loved and use it as currency. They know you'll explain away red flags, that you'll try harder, give more, love deeper, because deep down you still think love is something to be earned. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The narcissist never has, but they know the empath hasn't either. And that's the foundation of the game, your empathy against their emptiness. But every game ends when one player stops playing. Before the healing, the empath is not weak, but they are unguarded. They love without armor. They give without a pause. They confuse tolerance with compassion, and overfunctioning with love. They bleed so others don't have to. And often, they don't even notice they're bleeding. This is the wounded empath. The one who says yes when they mean no. The one who explains away emotional abuse as they're just hurt. The one who stays and stays and stays because they believe love means endurance. They are boundaryless, not because they don't want limits, but because they were never taught how to set them without fear of abandonment. Their nervous system is trained to scan the room for unspoken needs, because somewhere in their story they learned that being needed is the closest thing to being loved. That's not empathy. That's survival. You see, the wounded empath doesn't just feel deeply, they fix compulsively. Not out of arrogance, but out of an unconscious belief. If I can just love them enough, maybe I'll finally be enough too. That's the root of the trauma bond, when love becomes fused with pain and chaos feels like home. They are not addicted to the narcissist. They are addicted to the hope that this time maybe it won't end in self-abandonment. And that hope keeps them hooked long after the kindness disappears. But here's where the shift begins. When the empath finally realizes that fixing someone is not the same as loving them, that self-sacrifice is not virtue, it's self-erasure, that true empathy must include the self. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the path of becoming whole. And for the empath, it starts the moment they stop abandoning themselves to earn a love that was never real. It doesn't begin with an explosion. It begins with a whisper. A quiet sense that something isn't right, though everything looks fine. The compliments still come, the connection still flickers, the world still thinks you're lucky, but deep inside, something starts to ache in places you can't name. The empath begins to feel it. Exhaustion without cause, confusion without clarity, emotional depletion that sleep can't fix. They're pouring everything they have into someone who only knows how to drink, never to fill. And then it hits, not all at once, but in waves. I don't feel safe here. I'm always walking on eggshells. Why do I feel invisible in a relationship where I give so much? This is the first crack in the illusion, the moment the story begins to unravel. The charm no longer distracts. The justifications start to sound hollow. The mask the narcissist wears begins to slip, and the empath finally sees. It was never love. It was possession. It was control wrapped in charm. It was performance dressed as intimacy. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And for so long, the empath called this love. They called the chaos chemistry. They called the pain passion. But now they start to see. And once you see, you cannot unsee. This isn't the healing yet. This is the awakening, the part that hurts the most, the death of the dream, the slow, gut-wrenching realization that what felt like destiny was actually a reenactment of every wound they never addressed. And that's exactly where the power begins. Something breaks, but it doesn't sound like shattering glass. It sounds like silence, like space, like breath, like the absence of begging. The empath stops chasing, stops explaining, stops trying to decode every mood, every manipulation. They no longer ask, "What did I do wrong?" They begin to ask, "Why do I keep allowing this?" That question is a blade. It cuts through illusion and opens the door to truth. And in that stillness, the empath does something radical. They turn inward. Not to collapse, but to reclaim. To gather the pieces they scattered across years of self-abandonment. To feel what they never had permission to feel. Anger, grief, rage, exhaustion, desire. They stop trying to save the narcissist. They stop trying to be the emotional bridge in a one-sided relationship. They stop apologizing for their needs. Because they finally understand, self-sacrifice is not love, it's self-erasure. This isn't loud. There's no speech, no confrontation, no revenge fantasy. This is a quiet rebellion. The empath begins to speak a new language, the language of boundaries. Not to hurt others, but to stop hurting themselves. No, that doesn't work for me. I need space. I don't owe anyone an explanation. They stop reacting and start responding. They stop leaking energy and begin preserving it. And in doing so, something unimaginable happens. They feel peace. Not because the world around them changed, but because they finally stopped bleeding for it. This is not the end of the empath. This is the beginning of the healed one. And that version? That version is unstoppable. The turning point doesn't happen when the empath forgives the narcissist. It happens when they forgive themselves. For not seeing sooner. For staying too long. For giving so much to someone who gave nothing back. But before that grace arrives, something deeper must take place: shadow work. Carl Jung taught that we all have a shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves we deny, suppress, or disown. The empath, who is always identified as the good one, now faces a terrifying truth. They carry shadows too. Not just light, not just kindness, not just healing. Inside them lives anger, resentment, rage, a hunger to be seen, a fear of being left, a need to be chosen. These were never sins, they were wounds. But wounds ignored become chains. And so the empath enters the mirror. Not the one on their wall, but the one held up by every relationship that drained them. They look at what they've called compassion and see that sometimes it was fear. They look at what they called loyalty and see that sometimes it was trauma. They look at what they called love and realize it was a plea. Please don't abandon me. Shadow work is not about blame. It's about wholeness. About bringing light to the parts of the self once kept hidden. And in doing so, something radical happens. The empath stops needing to be nice and starts being authentic. They stop overgiving and start aligning. They stop seeking validation and begin generating worth from within. This is the real power, not the power to control others, but the power to see yourself fully and still say, "I am enough." True healing begins not when you become someone new, but when you finally own all that you are. Healing, contrary to fantasy, is not graceful. It is a collapse, a surrender, a slow, sacred death of everything false. The empath, once the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the emotional anchor, begins to unravel. Roles they once wore like second skin fall away. Relationships they held on toggin. Identities they built their entire sense of self around crumbling. And in that unraveling, there is grief. Grief for the girl who overextended, for the woman who made herself small, for the version of themselves who called self-neglect love. But this grief is sacred. Because this is not destruction, it is rebirth. You cannot step into your truth while still wearing the costumes of your past. And so the empath lays them down. All of them. Even the ones that brought comfort, even the ones that earned praise, especially the ones that made them feel needed. This is the part of the journey where everything feels empty, where you wonder who you are without the roles, the relationships, the rescuer narrative. You are not yet who you're becoming, but you're no longer who you were. This is the void, the cocoon, the in-between, and it is holy ground, because this is where the ego dies so the soul can speak. Carl Jung called it the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, rather than who the world told you to be. And it doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the dark, in the silence, in the solitude that strips away everything that isn't you. The death of the old identity is not the end. It's the initiation. And on the other side of that death, a version of you no narcissist can ever touch. The healing is not a single moment. It is a series of quiet revolutions. And then, one day, without warning, you don't respond the same way. You don't flinch when they withdraw. You don't chase when they go silent. You don't bend just to keep the peace. Something has changed. The empath no longer confuses love with sacrifice. They no longer offer their soul as payment for someone else's presence. They've learned, love isn't meant to cost your identity. Love, real love, never asks you to go missing in order to feel seen. And so, they stop looking outward for closure. They stop rehearsing conversations in their head. They stop waiting for an apology that will never come. Instead, they become their own closure. They write the ending. They seal the chapter. They walk out of the fire not asking why it burned, but knowing they survived. Now, their energy is different. Still warm, but no longer leaking. Still kind, but no longer accommodating to disrespect. There's a stillness to them now. A depth. An unmistakable magnetism. Because they are rooted. They are whole. They are no longer seeking. They are attracting. The healed empath radiates a new frequency. Not loud, not forced, but so clear, so grounded that it either draws people in or pushes them away. And either outcome is fine. Because their value is no longer dependent on being needed. They are no longer a sponge. They are a mirror. Reflecting truth. Holding boundaries. Walking in self-respect. This isn't a glow-up. This is a rebirth. And it cannot be undone. They always come back. Not because they love you, but because they lost control of you. And control is the only language they speak. The narcissist returns, expecting the old script. They think a few sweet words, a nostalgic memory, a breadcrumb of attention will reopen the door. They don't realize the house has been rebuilt. The locks have changed. And more importantly, you have changed. Where you once would have responded immediately, you now pause. Where you once defended, explained, proved, you now simply say, no. And that shocks them. Because you're no longer reactive. You're no longer available for emotional roulette. The game doesn't work when one player puts down the controller. They try the same tricks. Charm, guilt, rage. Testing to see if the hook is still there. But you don't bite. Not out of bitterness. But because you've outgrown the bait, your silence, your calm, your refusal to participate. It destabilizes them. Because for the first time, they are facing a version of you that doesn't need them. A version they didn't think you'd ever become. You don't hate them. You don't wish them harm. You simply see them clearly now. And that clarity? That is what terrifies them. Because a healed empath can't be manipulated. They can't be guilted or seduced back into a cage they've already burned. And so the narcissist, once the puppet master, stands there holding strings with no one attached. That's the moment they realize the most powerful thing you ever did was walk away without turning back. True power doesn't roar. It doesn't slam doors or seek attention. It doesn't need to prove anything. True power is quiet, unshakable, undeniable. The healed empath doesn't walk into a room looking for signs of safety anymore. They are the safety. They don't scan faces for approval. They meet the world from the inside out. They no longer fall for the smile with a hidden agenda. They see it immediately. Manipulation used to feel like confusion. Now it feels like clarity. Because when you've walked through the fire, you recognize the smoke. When you've danced with the mask, you recognize the eyes behind it. The healed empath doesn't seek revenge. That's a language for the still wounded. They don't plot, confront, or chase karmic justice. They simply choose distance. They choose silence. They choose sovereignty. And that choice is more disruptive than any retaliation, because nothing confuses the manipulator more than being met with indifference instead of reactivity. Peace becomes their rebellion. Groundedness becomes their protection. Stillness becomes their strength. They don't argue. They observe. They don't explain. They exit. This is the empath who now sees. And what they see, they do not unsee. Not in others. And finally, not in themselves. Energy doesn't lie. It speaks before words. It moves before logic. It attracts. It repels. And the empathon's porous, once open to everyone and everything, now vibrates at a different frequency. Calm, grounded, clear. And this shift is not subtle. Toxic people feel it immediately. They don't know why they're uncomfortable, only that they are. They used to approach the empath with ease. Now, they hesitate. They feel exposed, disarmed, unwelcome not by hostility, but by the absence of availability. Because the healed empath no longer radiates need, no longer whispers, "Please love me," no longer broadcasts unworthiness. They no longer attract chaos because they no longer carry inner chaos. What once lived inside the unhealed wounds, the people-pleasing patterns, the fear of abandonment has been seen, named, and healed. And with that healing comes a recalibration. Now, they attract equals, not emotional projects. Partners, not fix-me cases. Friends who pour back, not drain. Conversations that feed, not consume. People who once fed on their empathy can no longer find a way in. Because that old door? It's been closed. Welded shut with wisdom. The healed empath doesn't need to protect themselves with walls. Their energy protects them. It says, "I'm not available for dysfunction." I don't argue with projections. I don't confuse chaos with connection. And so, slowly, quietly, their world changes. Not overnight. Not with fanfare, but with clarity. Because, when the inside shifts, the outside must follow. There is a moment in the healing journey that marks a quiet revolution. It's not loud. It doesn't shake the earth. But it shifts your entire world. It's the moment you say no. Without explaining. Without apologizing. Without guilt. The empath, once addicted to harmony, once terrified of conflict, once fluent in the language of self-abandonment, now speaks a different truth. Because no is not just a word. It's a boundary, a prayer, a declaration of worth. No, says, I will no longer betray myself to keep the peace. No, says, I'm no longer a canvas for your projections. No, says, my time, energy, and emotions are sacred. Carl Jung taught that what we reject inwardly becomes our shadow. But what the healed empath learns is that boundaries are not rejection. They are self-respect made visible. They are the edges that define where you end and someone else begins. And for the first time, the empath honors that edge. They stop rescuing people who refuse to rescue themselves. They stop softening truth to remain likable. They stop negotiating with manipulation. They realize that the most loving thing they can offer the world is a whole, unfractured version of themselves. And that version begins with the sacred no, because no creates the space where peace can grow, where clarity can return, where authenticity can finally breathe. The healed empath doesn't become a coach. They don't start quoting mantras or building stages. They don't turn their pain into a platform for applause. They simply live differently. And that difference is felt. They no longer guide with effort. They guide with presence. When you sit beside someone who has healed without bitterness, who holds themselves with softness and strength, who speaks from alignment, not performance, you feel it. You rise without even knowing why. This is the new kind of leadership. No rescuing, no preaching, no fixing, just embodiment. The healed empath no longer tells others how to love themselves. They show what it looks like. They no longer give advice that isn't asked for. They hold space, deep, grounded, non-judgmental space for others to discover their own truth. They don't need to prove their growth. They walk it. And in doing so, they give silent permission for others to do the same. Carl Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." The healed empath has awakened, not to lead others, but to lead themselves. And that self-leadership is contagious. In a world that screams, they are the calm. In a world that performs, they are the truth. In a world that hides, they are transparency. Their leadership isn't about being followed. It's about being free. And in their freedom, they become the mirror that reminds others of who they already are. Whole. Capable. Enough. The narcissist doesn't understand endings. Only supply. Only cycles. They return not because they care, but because they assume the door is still open. But this time, something has changed. The music is playing, but the empath isn't dancing. Where once there was engagement, now there is stillness. Where once there was longing, now there is peace. Where once there was a deep hunger to be chosen, now there is no appetite for the game. The narcissist loses control, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. They may rage. They may retreat. They may try again with charm or chaos. But each attempt falls flat, not because the narcissist has changed, but because the empath has. The emotional hooks don't sink in anymore. The manipulations don't land. The bait is recognized and ignored. This is the death of the loop, the unraveling of the dance that once kept them both stuck in a choreography of pain. Because the empath no longer plays the part of healer, savior, sacrifice, or emotional sponge, and the narcissist, sensing the loss of power, does the only thing they know. They either leave to seek someone new to mold, or they continue trying, failing, and fading. But for the healed empath, this is liberation. Not loud, not celebrated, but undeniable. The cycle is broken, and in that stillness, the empath finally meets themselves. Carl Jung called it individuation, the sacred process of becoming whole, not perfect, not invulnerable, but integrated. The healed empath doesn't shine because they avoided darkness. They shine because they walked through it. They didn't bypass pain, they faced it, sat with it, listened to its message. And in doing so, they became more than just a nice person. They became a true self. Not a half-light, people-pleasing shadow, but a full-spectrum human being, light and shadow, tender and fierce, boundaried and loving, whole. They no longer live in fragments, no longer outsource their worth, no longer confuse empathy with self-erasure. They've returned to themselves. And here's the quiet truth. They are not above pain. They still feel deeply. But they are beyond manipulation. Because no one can twist what you've already owned. No one can exploit what you've already integrated. No one can use your wounds when you've turned them into wisdom. This is the empath's final power, not in fixing others, but in becoming whole, not in being chosen, but in choosing themselves, not in defeating the narcissist, but in transcending the need for that battle at all. They no longer seek a hero. They've become their own. And in that quiet wholeness, they become the one thing the narcissist never expected: untouchable. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.